right. Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started, but first I want to welcome you all to the webinar and thank you all so much for joining us today and taking the time to be here. My name is Kayla Ripple, and I'm a principal associate with the Lenfest Ocean Program. So for those of you who may not know us, the Lenfest Ocean Program is a grant-making program. We fund ocean and coastal research projects to address the needs facing decision makers and stakeholders. You can learn more about us and the projects we fund at lenfestocean.org. And while you're there, you can also sign up for our newsletter to receive updates about projects like the ones you'll hear about today. If you're on Twitter, be sure to follow us at lenfestocean. In fact, we'll be live tweeting this webinar on the hashtag LOPwebinar, so feel free to use it too if you'd like to engage with us there. Today is the sixth webinar in a series that highlights projects from our Climate Resilient Fisheries grant portfolio. This portfolio contains projects that are addressing a range of topics such as predicting range shifts of important fish stocks, understanding the climate vulnerability of coastal communities, and providing guidance on adaptive management for fisheries, among other things. Our goal is to support projects where scientists are working with managers and stakeholders to better understand how climate change will impact fisheries and can therefore help them develop solutions that foster climate-ready fisheries. So if you're interested in learning more about those projects, my colleague Emily Knight will be dropping a link in the chat box. And here you can also view and sign up for our upcoming webinars in this series. We actually have webinars scheduled every month through January 2025. So lots coming up. Our next webinar will be Wednesday, October 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific time on how adaptive capacity can enhance climate resilient fisheries. And Emily will drop a link for that in the chat as well. Although we have two more webinars coming up in October and they're not part of this Climate Resilient Fisheries webinar series, but I wanted to highlight them here as they may be of interest to this group. But that webinar will be a two-part webinar on 2 different days in October on how portfolio theory can help facilitate EBFM. And those links will also get dropped in the chat, so feel free to register for that. But for today's webinar, we're excited to have joining us Dr. Olaf Jensen with the University of Wisconsin and Dr. Rujia B with the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission, but she was with University of Wisconsin for the majority of this work. Their project is focused on understanding uncertainty in stock assessments and how and which stock assessments may be most impacted or affected by climate change variability. Emily's going to drop a link to their project page if you'd like to see some of their recent publications and read their fact sheet about the project itself. They currently have one paper out that's focused on understanding buffers for scientific uncertainty in stock assessments, and they're working on a second paper that will build upon this. So we're really excited to have them here today to share the results or some of their results in this webinar. And before we get started, just a few logistical things. To prevent any feedback or echoes, all attendees are muted, but we do want to hear from you. So please feel free to drop your comments or other resources you think would be useful to share with others in the chat box during the webinar. And if you have a question for the speakers, you can submit that in the Q&A box. I'll be keeping track of those through the webinar, and at the end, I'll read questions aloud for Olaf and Rujia to answer. If we don't get to your question or if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to us or the research team after the webinar. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded. We'll distribute the link broadly afterwards, so please feel free to share this with others. And again, follow up with us or members of the research team if you have any questions. So with that, I think I've covered most of the logistics. And Olaf, I'm going to turn it over to you now. And Emily, you should be able to share your screen.
Thanks, Kayla. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, sound great.
Okay. All set. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us here. I just want to start out by acknowledging the project team here, in addition to Rujia and I, who you'll hear from today. Roger Mann, Kathy Mills, Vince Sava, and John Wiedemann were all part of the project team for this. Next. So if I like to start with an analogy here, if you think of managing a fishery as being the captain of a large vessel, in that case, stock assessments are sort of your navigational system. They can't tell you where you want to go, but they can tell you where you are and help you get there. But they're not like a GPS or modern chart plotter here. Next. They're probably something more akin to celestial navigation, where there's a whole lot of uncertainty, and you need to buffer for that uncertainty if you're safely going to get where you're going to go. Both technologies can let you cross oceans, but you have to use them in a different way. And so what we're trying to do with this project is figure out exactly how much buffering we need to do for scientific uncertainty in stock assessments to safely keep our fisheries on course. Next slide. So precautionary fishery management involves taking into account scientific uncertainty. So with precautionary management, we no longer try to come right up to the targets. We instead buffer away from those. So if we think about the overfishing limit, for example, which is the best estimate of the maximum amount of a stock that can be harvested in a year without resulting in overfishing, we don't want to target that overfishing limit because there's a very good chance that we'll surpass it. Instead, we need to come up with some kind of a buffer that allows us to step back a little bit from that limit. And in the US system, we call that the acceptable biological catch. So that's the annual catch level that takes that OFL and then reduces it for scientific uncertainty. Next. And one way that we do that in the US, and there are a few different ways, but one way is to have the managers define a target risk of overfishing, and then to take the uncertainty distribution, this is a statistical distribution, in the OFL and figure out where you need to set the ABC in order to achieve that target risk of overfishing. So for example, if the managers decide that a 25% risk of overfishing is acceptable, next slide, then we have a way of quantitatively deciding what the ABC should be if we know the uncertainty distribution of that overfishing limit. We can take that probability distribution and set the ABC such that the probability of overfishing is indeed 25%. So that understanding of the distribution, the uncertainty distribution of the OFL is critical. Next. So the project goals then are to characterize stock assessment performance. In this case, performance is consistency. Develop empirically grounded guidance for the size of these buffers for scientific uncertainty, not just for the OFL, which is a key one for management, but also from other stock assessment outputs. And then switch to understanding how climate change might be impacting this assessment performance. And the overall goal of this work is not to improve stock assessments. There's a ton of very talented stock assessment scientists working on that question. Instead, we want to know how much to trust them. How much do we have to buffer away from them? Next. And the components of scientific uncertainty that we're really focused on here are precision specifically. So unless you're doing a simulation analysis, we don't know the true OFL or other parameters for the population or stock. But what we can measure is precision. Essentially, how much variation is there among stock assessments in estimates of the same quantity. And because you can be precise without being accurate, the precision is a minimum buffer for scientific uncertainty. So if the estimates overall are unbiased, and I use bias just in the statistical sense, if the estimates are unbiased, then the precision and accuracy are equal. But if there's any bias, that shifts things away from that as well. So precision then is a minimum buffer for scientific uncertainty. Next. So climate change can also impact stock assessment performance. And if we think about that, we know, for example, that it can impact a lot of biological processes that affect the ability of stocks to withstand harvest. So all of the critical rates in fish populations, births, deaths, immigration, emigration, and somatic growth of the body, all of these are temperature dependent and likely impacted by other aspects of climate change as well. The natural mortality rate as well, the stock recruitment relationship, even the stock definition and stock boundaries we know are changing as stocks shift. And often these parameters are necessarily treated as constants within stock assessments, not because the stock assessment scientists don't understand biology and don't understand that these can vary, but because we may not have the data needed to parameterize them in more of a time-varying way. Climate change can also affect our ability to observe populations accurately, the observation effect. So climate change, even without directly impacting the biology, can also impact our ability to assess stocks. For example, range shifts can change the overlap between a fish population and the footprint of a fishery independent survey. Next. Jason Link had a really great paper about this. If we just focus on one example here, the one on the left for a range shift, you've got that population, the green blob there on the top left, moving with respect to the boundary of, say, a fishery independent survey. The actual stock size isn't changing, but as it shifts out of the survey footprint, what you get is an apparent reduction in stock size. If it then is shifting into another survey footprint, you can get an apparent increase in stock size. So climate change really affects the biology, and it affects our observation process for populations. So there's good reason to think it can impact assessment performance. Next. And I'll give you another good example of why some circumstantial evidence for how climate change might be impacting assessment performance already. And that's New England groundfish. So the Gulf of Maine, as we know from Andy Pershing et al.'s paper in 2015, has been warming at just an extraordinary rate, well outside of the norm across the world here. It's a little hard to see in the map at the bottom there, but that red spot indicating truly exceptional trends in warming, that's the Gulf of Maine. Next. And if we look at the performance of stock assessments for groundfish in the Gulf of Maine, they've left a lot to be desired. So this is results from an analysis by John Wiedemann and I that looked at past projections that were done from stock assessments, projecting the target catch to achieve a target fishing mortality rate. And what you can see here is that on the x-axis there, that's the catch. Relatively rarely did the catch exceed the target from the projections. So the management system was able to constrain the catch to be at or under the target catch. That didn't result in keeping the fishing mortality rates or Fs under at or under the target. You can see some of those Fs ended up being extraordinarily high. And most likely what was going on here is they're chasing a moving target. Climate change is changing the underlying productivity of a lot of these stocks, and the assessments aren't able to keep up. A lot of other things going on, of course, as well. Next. So that's just a case study, and we know that a lot of different factors can influence assessment performance. If you've got good enough data, that can fix a lot of problems in the assessment. If you don't have good underlying data, the assessments are going to be fundamentally limited in terms of their accuracy. And by good data, we mean surveys that really effectively index the relative abundance of that species and cover the whole stock distribution. Also good biological information ideally at an annual time step. That's sort of the gold standard that we'd always like to achieve. And then you have to have model structures that can make use of that data as well. Fish life history matters as well. So slow life histories are inherently easier to predict, at least in the short term, because you've had multiple years to observe previous cohorts in the assessment. And climate change, of course, is more complex than just something like sea surface temperature, right? So getting the variable right there in terms of incorporating climate change into assessments, that's tricky because there are a lot of different ways that can happen. So the goal of this research is really to tease apart all of these different factors and see if we can identify a signal attributed to climate change on assessment uncertainty. Next. And to do that, we've made use of a global database of stock assessments, the RAM Legacy Stock Assessment Database, which critically now contains multiple assessments of many individual stocks. So we can see how the assessment advice has changed over time. And I'm just going to turn it over to Rujia here to give us a lot more detail about the methods and to go over some of the results. And then I'll come back when it's time to discuss the results in the broader context. Go ahead, Rujia.
Yeah, thank you, Olaf. So we selected stocks from the RAM Legacy database for analysis. Next slide, please. There are over 1,000 stocks in the database, among which there are over 400 US stocks. First, we picked stocks with at least 2 assessments. Most stocks were filtered out in this step, and only 449 stocks remained, including 88 US stocks. Most stocks with only 1 assessment in the US are salmon species, and most salmon species are not assessed from assessment, so we didn't focus on them. Then we picked stocks with biomass and fishing mortality estimates, and got 263 stocks with both biomass and fishing mortality estimates. Another 14 stocks in the US South Atlantic were added into the analysis. So a total of 838 assessments from 277 stocks were included in our analysis. Next, please. Here is a map showing stocks incorporated in this analysis. Stocks in the US are grouped into the corresponding management councils. Stocks in other regions, such as Europe, are grouped into the corresponding countries. Ovals represent high seas areas. Next. The first part of our analysis was to model inter-assessment uncertainty. We analyzed the 7 model estimates, including biomass, fishing mortality, BMSY, FMSY, B by BMSY, F by FMSY, and OFL. For each stock, we conducted pairwise comparisons among these model estimates from all available assessments. For each comparison, we determined the target year as the terminal year in the older assessment. We focused on terminal year estimates as these are the most relevant to management decision making. To model the inter-assessment uncertainty, model estimates of each stock follow a log normal distribution with a stock target year unique mean and a hierarchically setted standard deviation. We set 4 hierarchical settings on the coefficient of variation, which is a function of standard deviation. A common CV for all stocks, CV varied across regions, CV varied across regions and time periods between assessments, and CV varied across regions and time periods, but assumed the difference between CV long and CV short is a positive constant. Here is an example showing how comparisons were set for stocks with more than 2 assessments. The school whiting stock in Australia had 3 assessments, A1, A2, and A3, resulting in 3 comparisons, A1 and A2 in 2007, A1 and A3 in 2007, and A2 and A3 in 2008. CV short was used based on the differences between their terminal years for A1 and A2, while CV long was used for A1 and A3, and A2 and A3. Next. Pairwise comparisons of log transformed model estimates among assessments for the same stock showed no evidence of bias. In general, the fitted linear regressions were very similar to the red 1-to-1 line. Although model estimates appeared unbiased overall, there was a tendency for usually low values from the older assessment to be adjusted upward in the recent assessment, and the high values to be adjusted downward in the recent assessment. Some very obvious outliers were observed, marked by these colored points. And many of these were associated with changes in the underlying assessment method, assumed values of natural mortality, changes in definition of reference points, and changes in input data. Next. The comparison of stock status determined in the recent assessment and the older assessment revealed some uncertainty, but this uncertainty was centered on the nominal values. For example, when the older assessment showed B by BMSY is 0.5, that is the critical value used in the US to determine if a stock is overfished. The probability of being overfished in the recent assessment was 48%. When the older assessment showed F by FMSY is 1, the probability of overfishing in the recent assessment was 48%. Next. Here is the model selection results. The DIC for the 4 models with different CV configurations for the 7 model estimates suggests that except for the FTY model with a varied CV across regions and time periods, but CV long minus CV short is a positive constant, achieved better performance. For the FTY model with a varied CV across regions and time periods achieved better performance. The global mean CV of F derived from the best model are greatest with a posterior median of 45% and a 95% credible interval of 36 to 58, followed by the OFL, F by FMSY, and by biomass. The B by BMSY, and FMSY have lower global CVs. Next. Here are regional specific CV long and CV short for B by BMSY, F by FMSY, and OFL. For the biomass ratio, the CV was greatest for Australia, followed by the US Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council. For the F ratio, the CV was greatest for the US Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council. For the OFL, the CV was greatest for Pacific Ocean high seas, followed by the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and lowest in Europe. Next. So why are there regional differences? First, let's talk about the data limitation. The availability, coverage, and the density of survey vary widely across regions. This means that in some areas we have robust data, while in others it's sparser. This directly affects the reliability of the assessment. Another issue is recreational harvest data. It's difficult to estimate accurately because it often relies on voluntary reporting and can vary a lot across seasons. This can create inconsistency in the data we are working with. Next, the assessment process itself can differ. Some regions may have more comprehensive data updates or model revisions, while others may rely on older or less detailed assessments. This can lead to variations in how stocks are assessed and perceived. For example, benchmark assessments incorporate more significant data and model updates, which may cause higher inter-assessment uncertainty. Environmental factors can also cause differences. Regions experience unique patterns of temperature change, habitat variability, and other ecological shifts. These changes can influence fish stocks differently across regions, impacting the outcomes of assessments. It's important to know that these factors don't reflect the quality of work by the assessment team. This slide is not a scorecard for them. It's just about understanding why inter-assessment uncertainty may vary across regions. Next. So as mentioned before, the ABC is set downward from the OFL using the P-start method in a number of US regional fishery management councils. The difference between the OFL and ABC is the buffer to account for the scientific uncertainty. So we transfer the CVs of the OFL distribution to the buffer to get a better understanding. Next. For example, the US New England Fishery Management Council uses 75% of the OFL to set the ABC. So that means the difference between the ABC and OFL is 25%, which corresponds to an OFL CV of about 160%, with a target probability of overfishing, P star, is 0.4. Next. Yeah. The follow-up analysis was to explain variation in assessment performance as a function of climate and other environmental changes, as well as characteristics of the species and the assessment model. For climate change covariate, we mainly focus on the marine heat wave derived from a high-resolution sea surface temperature database. Next. Explanatory variables considered include sea surface temperature. To be more specific, we considered sea surface temperature trend and marine heat wave, chlorophyll A concentration, assessment model and data characteristics like general model type, for example, biomass dynamic or age structured, and the parameter settings, habitat, region, and stock that represent additional unobserved differences. Next. In the following, I will show some details on how we got marine heat wave for each stock. First, we overlaid the stock boundary on the SST grid and obtained monthly SST for each stock. Next. We select black sea bass in the mid-Atlantic as an example, and take a closer look at how the marine heat wave index was calculated for this stock. This stock appears to be one of the climate change winners in the Northeast US. Next. First, we calculated the monthly varying 90th percentile SST during 1982 to 1995 as thresholds. Next. Then we obtained the count of months that exceeded the monthly varying threshold from 5 years prior to the terminal year of the older assessment to the terminal year of the recent assessment. For black sea bass in the mid-Atlantic, the time period considered was from 2006 to 2015. Next. In 2006, there were 2 months with SST above the thresholds. Next. In the whole time period, total marine heat wave count was 43, and this number was incorporated into our analysis. Next. Then we fitted generalized additive models to the data. Next. Covariates peaked included marine heat wave count, changes in assessment model, habitat type, thermal niche, region, stock, and assessment interval. Next. So the preliminary results suggest that as marine heat wave count increases, the inter-assessment variation increases as well. And fish stocks located in the warm end of their thermal niche show greater variation under the ocean warming. Next. There are strong regional differences in the impacts of marine heat wave on inter-assessment variation. We estimated regional uncertainty based on the average marine heat wave count for an earlier period, that is the first years of the assessments, and a later period, the most recent 5 years. Calculated the difference for each stock, and then averaged this difference across all stocks within one region, and got the map. In the US Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council, the marine heat wave count has significantly increased, linked to significantly increased uncertainty. Then I will give back to Olaf for the discussion.
Great, thanks very much, Rujia. So I just wanted to summarize here and put this in the context of management in the US and where we set our buffers. And I think, to give away the story right here, I think by and large the results confirm the levels of uncertainty that are considered by management and the buffering that's already been done. I think probably the best proof of that is that overfishing and overfished status are relatively rare across the different council managed stocks. So if we look here, our analysis suggested that the mean CVs for the overfishing limit were 83% for the Mid-Atlantic region and 62% for the Pacific Fishery Management Council. And we can compare those then to the size of the buffers and the assumptions about the OFL-CV that are used in those regions. So for the Mid-Atlantic, the Scientific and Statistical Committee currently uses 3 bins for the OFL-CV, 60, 100, or 150%, based on scoring that each stock with a table of attributes that should be related to assessment uncertainty. The mean there falls pretty close to the center, so 83%. From our analysis is within that range there used within the Mid-Atlantic. For the Pacific Fishery Management Council, for very data-rich stocks, they use a lower CV of 36%, which is a bit under the 62% mean CV, but they also use higher CVs for data-limited and data-poor stocks. Just to reiterate, these CVs should be considered a lower bound for setting buffers for scientific uncertainty, both because they represent precision and not accuracy, and also because the OFL CVs are applied to projections for the future. We don't set harvest limits for the terminal year of the assessment, that's already passed by the time we get the assessment. Instead, we're applying the OFL CVs to projected OFLs for future years. Those are likely to be even more uncertain than the terminal year estimates that we analyzed here, because there's no information yet about the future. Next. And in terms of the climate change impacts, I think, as we've seen here, as the occurrence of these marine heat wave events becomes more frequent, inter-assessment variation should also increase. The regional differences are still large. The regional differences are probably the dominant component of variation here. But once we account for those regional differences, we see this marine heat wave effect. If we want to then achieve the same target risk of overfishing, that P star, as marine heat waves become more frequent, we would need greater buffers for scientific uncertainty to maintain the same P star. Next. Okay, I just want to thank you all again for participating in the webinar here. I'm really looking forward to questions. I want to acknowledge the funding from the LEMFest Ocean program, as well as helpful conversations with a number of folks outside of the primary project team as well. And finally, the assessment scientists and contributors to the RAM legacy database. All of this is built on outputs from their work. So thank you very much, and we'd be happy to take questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Olaf and Rujia, for sharing some of those results and your insights around this project. We did get a couple of questions in the Q&A while you were presenting, so I can start with those, but everyone else, please feel free to type in your questions to that Q&A box. You can also put them in the chat box, but I'll be watching the Q&A one a lot more closely. So if I don't get to your question, I'll start looking at some of the chats as well. So our first question may be a little bit outside the scope of this, but outside the scope of this project, but I wanted to pose it here to see if you had any insights. But the USGS is developing a report on the effects of climate change on biodiversity in the ocean. Will this affect fish stock assessments for essential fish habitat productive capacity?
Yeah, so as far as I understand it, the essential fish habitat delineations are not based directly on stock assessment outputs, but certainly the same underlying ecological processes are in play, right? As climate change changes all sorts of things in the ocean, from temperatures to heat wave frequency to salinity, as well as the distribution of different organisms, that the locations of essential fish habitat will change. We haven't been in touch with the folks from USGS working on that, but we'd be very happy to engage with them if that would be helpful.
Great, thank you. And then one person asked two questions, but I'm going to try to combine them a little bit. The first question is kind of broad and focused on where do we need to improve data collection to understand climate impacts on fisheries better, but then making it a little bit more specific, what areas of stock assessment research are still lacking when it comes to incorporating climate change into those processes?
Sure. So there is a lot of research into how best to incorporate climate variables into assessments, and the frequency with which that's been done in assessments is really rising rapidly. In particular, some of the new state-based assessment frameworks are really well matched for including climate covariates. They can be used for different processes like predicting recruitment. The most recent black sea bass stock assessment is a good example that I'm familiar with there. I work on black sea bass, so we end up using that as an example a lot. Apologies, but the most recent assessment switched to a state-based framework and uses a climate covariate to help predict the recruitment there. So there's a lot of work being done. I think some of the regional patterns that we see reflect where we have good survey indices. If I don't know if we can put it back up, but if we looked at that map, you saw that there was some bright red in the Pacific Ocean. These are largely large pelagic stocks that are assessed without the benefit of having an index of relative abundance. So there's no survey that goes out in the open Pacific and trawls for tuna, for example. So some of the data limitations are clearly present in the analysis.
Great, thank you. Will you be making recommendations to NOAA on changes in survey methodologies and biological sampling based on your sensitivity analysis of the most critical parameters?
No, I think our results don't feed directly into survey recommendations. That there are a whole suite of considerations for surveys. In particular, right now, a lot of the surveys in the Northeast U.S. are dealing with the potential for wind energy development to mess up where the survey can occur. Our results don't speak directly to survey design. I think what they speak to is the end result of the process. How do we work with the inherent uncertainty in stock assessments? As the assessments improve, hopefully we'll see improved performance and ability to deal with some of these climate-driven changes that increase uncertainty. But it's certainly a tricky problem. But no, we won't be directly advising on the survey design. That's not where this comes into the process.
Absolutely. Are there ways for management councils to lower the uncertainty? It seems like increasing survey frequency or a footprint could be in play. But are there others, and are there ones that are likely to have the biggest impact? And does this vary across regions?
Certainly. So having good continuous surveys is a real foundation for accurate stock assessment. That's critically important. Having updated biological information as well is important. So, for example, as warming continues, we might see changes in somatic growth. Being able to incorporate those changes into the assessment depends on having the biological sampling teams able to estimate growth rates for those stocks. So there's a lot of different pieces that go into having accurate assessments and being able to keep up with climate change. It's kind of paradoxically, having just longer time series won't do it alone, right? Because really long time series without including time varying parameters means that the model has to fit to past conditions as well, which are no longer as relevant to the current or future. So unless we can get a good match between model development and new survey information, it's really tricky.
Great, thank you.
And sorry, Rujia, I'm kind of going ahead here. Please jump in, and I'll stand back.
Yeah, Rujia, feel free to jump in whenever it works for you. And if you have anything else to add to any of the questions, I can stop here for just a second. All right, sounds good. Well, the next question, do you feel this work speaks to the need for a management strategy evaluation to account for biological uncertainty, especially under climate change?
Fantastic. I'm really glad that question was asked, because management strategy evaluation can really help us in coming up with good harvest strategies that are robust to uncertainty in the assessment advice. Where that's been used, and it's been being increasingly used, it's generally led to stability and better performance, even in places where we don't get great assessment advice. There are management strategies you can use that kind of rely less on having updated and very accurate feedbacks with stock assessment. So that's critical.
Great. And Rujia, did you have anything you wanted to add? All right, I'm going to take that. If you are trying to talk, Rujia, you're muted, just so you know.
Just to follow up on the MSE question, I think this work potentially has feedbacks with MSE as well. The uncertainties here can be incorporated into management strategy evaluation. One of the unknowns in a lot of MSEs is how uncertain the assessments are, how uncertain the assessment advice is. And so this is one way of parameterizing that within MSE.
Great. We're getting a lot of questions, which is really exciting. So I'm just going to keep moving down the list since we have plenty of time left. As distribution of some species is more restricted or reduced with more intense climatic events, would changes in some model parameters of SAMs, such as catchability, would they also be appropriate?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, yeah, changes in catchability can happen as well with the overlap between the fishing footprint and the stock distribution shifting. That often results in a change in catchability. Whether the stock assessment models can incorporate that depends on the overall data availability, but many of them do accommodate at least selectivity blocks, so periods of constant selectivity for a block of time, and then another period of constant selectivity that's different. So there is some ability within the stock assessments to accommodate that when we see it happening. Whether we can accommodate it and accurately estimate it at the time it's happening, that's another question. Almost all the time with stock assessments, our ability to detect these things is sort of retrospective. We can see it after it's happened, but there's some lag there.
Great. This person says, thank you for your presentation. It was a really interesting analysis. Are they correct in understanding that your summary slide indicates that the Pacific Fishery Management Council may be underestimating the impacts of marine heat waves on scientific uncertainty in its stock assessments?
No, I don't think that's quite the appropriate takeaway there. There are a lot of things that come into the assessment uncertainty and the appropriateness of buffers, including, importantly, the risk tolerance of different councils. And risk policies are something that is rightly in the realm of management and not science. Science can certainly inform managers about the implications of risk policies, but how much risk of overfishing is acceptable? That's fundamentally not a scientific question. And so there's some variation among the councils and even among stocks about how much risk is acceptable there. So I think what our analysis does is indicate for those stocks managed by different councils what appropriate minimum levels of uncertainty might be there. But it's just one component of it, right? So as I said, we can assess inter-assessment consistency, but we don't know the true values. We're not doing a simulation here. We're just comparing different assessments. So that's why it's a minimum.
Great. Yeah, that's important. An important point to make. So a recent major paper found that retrospectively assessments are positively biased. Can you speak to how your results might differ from this paper?
Oh, good. I was hoping somebody would bring that up. Yeah, we've had a lot of conversations. There's been a bunch of email threads, people discussing this. We found very different results from the recent Edgar et al. Paper in Science that came out a few weeks ago. There's a number of important differences. We were using largely the same underlying data. So we both used the RAM legacy database as the basis for the analysis. We did find just some input errors or definitional errors that were corrected early on in our process. And we also entered some additional assessments. I say Rujia entered a lot of additional assessments by hand, a very time intensive process, and did a lot of QA/QC on those as well. So whether or not we're using exactly the same underlying data, I don't know. I don't know how that difference in QA/QC process went. But what we found, and let's put those slides up. I think this will be a lot easier to talk about with the slides there. So let's see.
I can try to share. Oh, no,
Slide 17 is the one we I'd like to look at. Yeah, great. If we can blow that up, that will help. So that slide 17, I think, is the analysis we did that most directly gets at uncertainty. So we looked at, at bias. We looked at the potential for bias and in a couple of ways. And when we didn't see it, we really focused on uncertainty. Let's go back one more. There we go. Great. So these are the in blue, it's the one-to-one line. If a point falls directly on the one-to-one line, that means the old assessment and the most recent assessment were exactly the same, right? And each point here represents one comparison between an old and a new assessment for each of those terminal year quantities that are shown there. And Edgar et al. Looked at biomass relative to a reference point. So the one that's probably most relevant is for comparing is the third from the left on the top there, B terminal year over BMSY. I don't know if we can show that with a cursor, but it's top row, second from right. Yep. There, one over, not BMSY. There we go, that one. What we see here is that the regression line for those data falls almost exactly on top of the one-to-one line. That's what we mean when we say there's not much evidence, in this case, no evidence for bias there. Certainly there's variation and uncertainty. That's what we're looking at here, but we didn't see evidence of bias there. These are log plots. That's something to keep in mind. And log plots of biomass, for example, tend to look misleadingly good because very large stocks are always going to be very large and very small stocks are always going to be very small. But when we're talking about a ratio here, that's not coming into play. This is biomass over BMSY, so the ratio of those two. So we don't have huge differences in scale among assessments that sort of stretch it out and make it look good. There's just no evidence of bias here. Now, the Edgar et al. Paper did not use BMSY. They used B max, so the maximum biomass over the course of the time series, which is a characteristic of the time series itself, and that probably has some undesirable properties there. But it allows you to get an estimate for many more stocks. BMSY estimates are not available for all the stocks in RAM Legacy. So there's trade-offs in doing it different ways. I'm not trying to say that Edgar et al. Did it wrong. They did it differently and somehow came up with a really different result. If you can go down to the next slide, I think that's maybe worth talking about as well with respect to evidence for bias. You might expect bias to creep into the process for stocks that are declared overfished or overfishing is occurring. They end up getting a lot more scrutiny. The assessments get more scrutiny because those declarations have implications for management. And so you might imagine, and I've heard people suggest this, that a stock is declared overfished. People go back and they look at the assessment and maybe tweak it, and the next thing you know, it was the next version of the assessment, it comes out as never having been overfished. This analysis addresses that possibility. So it's looking for bias near those definitional thresholds, and we just don't see it. This is really balanced at about a 50% chance of being overfished or overfishing in the most recent assessment when you're at that threshold. So really different results. And as I say, I think there's going to be some responses coming out soon with respect to the Edgar et al. Paper, trying to look at those differences. I see Rujia is trying to jump in here and talk, so I'll stop there. Go ahead, Rujia.
Yeah, so I just have a small point for that differences. So in our paper, for each stock, we conducted pairwise comparisons among model estimates from all available assessments, ranging from 2 to 8 assessments for one stock. while the science paper had just one comparison for each stock, that is oldest versus most recent assessment. So this might be the reason why we didn't observe fires, because we have compared lots of comparisons for one stock. And obviously, when we compare oldest and most recent assessment, the variation will be huge. Yeah.
Good point, Rujia. Maybe we can move on. I think we've talked about that one for a while. It's obviously something that's a lot of people are thinking about and talking about these days.
Yeah, I added a link to that paper as well for those who are attending and curious to know what we're referencing if you haven't read that paper yet. Great. So this person says, thanks for the great presentation. They're wondering if you, your group, or others are thinking about creating a dashboard for assessment uncertainty that could be updated regularly as new assessments are conducted. They're an SSC member with the Pacific Council, and they think that it could be really useful to have a tool like that to make assessment uncertainty more transparently available at a region-specific scale. So yeah, I'll stop there and let you respond.
I love that idea. It's not something that was within our original project scope, and our project is wrapping up, so I don't think we'll be able to do it under this project, but I agree that that's a really useful activity for the SSCs in particular, who are charged with making these decisions about how much to buffer for uncertainty. In fact, some of the ideas here came out of work that the Mid-Atlantic SSC was doing to figure out whether their buffers were in line with differences that we see between assessments. So it seems useful. It'd be great to have this kind of analysis updated as well. If you have thoughts about how to go about institutionalizing that, I would love to chat with you about that.
Ideas for the future. And then we're getting close to time, so we do have one more question in the chat that I'd like to get to. Are there effective ways to communicate these ideas of uncertainty and assessments to stakeholders? And can stakeholders use the degree of uncertainty to better inform their adaptations to climate change?
That is a fantastic point. I like that. I think communicating about scientific uncertainty is one of the hardest aspects of scientific communication to broader stakeholder groups. You know, things like the CV of the OFL, that's probably not going to get us there in terms of effective communication tools, right? We need to figure out better ways of talking about this, but fishermen deal with uncertainty all the time in their decision making, and they certainly know, probably better than we do, that they remind us plenty that the assessments aren't always consistent. So we often see changes in assessments, and that's not something that will come as a surprise to fishermen. I think trying to figure out ways of dealing with this uncertainty that don't involve just arbitrarily increasing buffer size are really important, because those buffers for uncertainty are lost economic opportunity to the fishery. I think they're necessary lost economic opportunity in order to meet our target probabilities or risks of overfishing, but we can't be arbitrary about them. They have big consequences for the fishing industry and for coming up with sustainable seafood. So I think there's a lot more to be done there in terms of working with stakeholders.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, with that, we've actually gone through the Q&A, so good timing. That's great. Thank you both, Rujia and Olaf, for your time today, and thanks everyone for attending this webinar. We'll be following up with a link to the recording, as well as many of the resources that were shared today in the chat. And thanks to those who also dropped resources in the chat. Really appreciate it. With that, we'll go ahead and end the webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day.